Welcome to Brinicle Reads. This is not a story about anger. It's not about revenge. And it's not about cutting people off. This is a story about a woman who spent her entire life explaining herself. Her pain, her silence, her kindness. Until one day, she stopped. If you've ever felt invisible in the very place you gave everything. If you've ever been told you're too quiet, too sensitive, or too much. This story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Listen closely. Because sometimes, the most powerful decision a person makes is choosing peace over permission. This is, I stopped explaining myself. And this is a story from Brinicle Reads. Always the giver. They say a woman's life can be measured by the people she holds together. If that's true, I've lived a very long life. I don't remember a time when I belonged only to myself. Even as a girl growing up in a small American town, I learned early that love meant adjusting, staying quiet, smiling when your chest felt tight, nodding even when you disagreed. My mother often said, "A good woman keeps the peace, no matter what." I believed her. I kept it so well that I forgot what standing straight felt like. I was the oldest of 3 girls. My father was quiet, practical, and hardworking. He loved us in ways I didn't fully understand, through chores, through providing, through quiet presence. My mother, on the other hand, had a softer voice but iron will. She taught me to notice everyone's needs first, to speak gently, to anticipate discomfort before it arose. She said, "It's better to bend than to break the family." I bent so much that I didn't even notice when I began to crumble. School was a training ground for me. I learned early that being agreeable won approval. I helped classmates with homework without being asked. I smoothed over conflicts that weren't mine. I volunteered for every group project and never complained. I learned to explain myself carefully, so no one felt accused of wrongdoing. I never realized it then, but I was practicing the habits that would define decades of my life. I married young, just out of college, not because I was in love with anyone, but because it felt like time to settle down. In our family, timing mattered more than feelings. My husband, Michael, was a good man in the way society defines it, responsible, steady, and reliable. He believed providing for the family equaled love. I believed understanding, empathy, and emotional connection equaled love. Between the two of us, something was always missing, but we never named it. It wasn't dramatic, and we didn't fight about it much. Instead, we built a life of routines and appearances. We had children quickly, our eldest son, then a daughter, then another son. Our house was filled with noise, laughter, tears, and arguments, but mostly, it was filled with my energy, my explanations, my attempts to hold everything together. Motherhood came like breathing. It was constant, exhausting, and invisible. I learned to wake before dawn to make breakfast, pack lunches, and wake children for school. I learned to cook while holding a crying infant, to smile when visitors came even when I hadn't slept, to soothe tempers while hiding my own anxiety. I learned to explain myself gently, carefully, so that no one would feel blamed by my feelings. "I'm not tired," I would say. "I'm fine," would insist. "It's nothing," I would laugh. And slowly, everyone believed me. As the children grew, my responsibilities multiplied. Parent-teacher conferences, scraped knees, broken hearts, teenage drama, college applications. I absorbed panic and released calm. When money was tight, I stretched meals and found coupons. When tempers flared, I softened my voice. When conflicts arose between siblings, I explained what each child meant and why they were upset. Explaining became my second language. If someone misunderstood my silence, I explained. If someone misinterpreted my words, I explained. If someone hurt me without realizing it, I explained why it hurt, softly, so no one would feel guilty. I thought this was love. I thought patience would eventually return to me. But love, I would learn later, does not always come back. Michael passed away when our children were grown enough to manage their own lives but young enough to still need guidance. After the funeral, after visitors left, after casseroles were no longer delivered, I remained the same, the anchor. Only now, no one noticed the weight I carried because anchors are not meant to move. The children had careers, spouses, ambitions. I encouraged them all. Told them to pursue what I never had courage to name. When they were busy, I understood. When they forgot to call, I excused them. When they spoke sharply, I reminded myself they were stressed. I explained them to myself. Eventually, my oldest son, David, invited me to live with his family. It's safer, he said. You won't be alone. Mothers always agree. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and left my home of 30 years, a house full of memories, a house that no longer belonged to anyone. Living with family is a strange kind of loneliness. Surrounded by people, yet reminded you are an addition, not the foundation. I adjusted again. Learned new routines, new silences. I woke early so I wouldn't disturb anyone. Ate less so food wouldn't run out. Spoke carefully so my words wouldn't be misunderstood. My daughter-in-law, Karen, was efficient, practical, and always busy. I tried to help, folding laundry, cooking, babysitting my granddaughter. But help is delicate. Give too much, it's interference. Give too little, it's laziness. So I explained. I'm only trying to help. I didn't mean it that way. Next time, I'll ask. Over time, explanations became expected. If something went wrong, I explained. If tension appeared, I explained. No one asked how I was. They assumed I was fine because I always had been. Inside me, a small ache began. Not loud, just persistent. I missed being spoken to without caution. Being asked, not instructed. Being seen as more than a role. But I didn't complain. Complaints require energy, and I was already tired. There were tiny, almost invisible moments when I felt myself fading. Conversations continued around me as if I weren't there. Decisions were made about my life without asking my opinion. Jokes were made at my expense, followed by laughter, as if to say it wasn't meant to hurt. I smiled. Explaining would have ruined the mood. My youngest daughter, Emily, visited sometimes. She noticed more than the others, but feared conflict. She would squeeze my hand, ask quietly if I was okay. I always nodded. What was the point of telling the truth if it would only make her carry my sadness? So I protected everyone, even from myself. At night, lying in a borrowed bed, I replayed conversations. What I said. What I should have said. How I could have explained myself better. Practiced gentler words, softer tones, as if one perfect explanation might make me easy to love. But love shouldn't require rehearsals. Still, I continued. Because stopping felt selfish. Because women like me are taught endurance is virtue. Because walking away was unthinkable. I told myself, this is just how families are. They don't mean it. If I explain it properly, they'll understand. I did not know then that understanding requires listening, and listening requires willingness. For now, I remained what I had always been. The giver. The buffer. The woman who explained herself into silence. And silence, I would soon learn, can either break you, or save you. Quiet neglect. Neglect does not arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a soft shadow sliding across a room. You notice it not as absence, but as presence without warmth. In the house of my eldest son, David, that shadow became routine. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Everyone is busy. Life moves fast. My own body was aging. Surely, I imagined the coldness in casual glances, the pauses in conversation when I entered a room, the way plans were made as if I were optional. I made myself smaller. Learned the rhythms of the house. I stayed in my room during arguments, waited until meals were over, softened the volume of my voice. I existed quietly, like furniture. No one asked me to do this. No one noticed. My days began before sunrise. The world outside the window was still, streets empty, streetlights flickering. I'd make a cup of coffee slowly, letting the steam warm my face. I watched the orange light seep through the blinds and listened to the muffled noises of the neighborhood waking up, mail trucks, dogs barking, a lawnmower down the street. For a few hours, I felt almost human. Almost seen. I spoke softly to myself just to hear my own voice. I planned my day in these quiet moments, not around anyone else's expectations. Then the house woke up. And I returned to my role. My granddaughter, Lily, became my little refuge. She was curious, always asking questions adults no longer thought to ask. "Grandma," she said one morning, twirling a strand of her hair, "why do you like that song so much?" I smiled, carefully. "Because it reminds me of a summer I once had, a long time ago." She tilted her head, absorbing the answer, satisfied for now. But as she grew, school, friends, and sports claimed more of her time. The chair beside mine stayed empty longer each day. Karen, my daughter-in-law, was practical, efficient, always busy. At first, she wasn't unkind. She managed the house like a well-oiled machine. I tried to help, fold laundry, cook meals, watch Lily, but every gesture seemed either too much or too little. I explained myself constantly. "I'm just helping. I didn't mean to interfere. Next time, I'll ask." Explanations became invisible. They expected them. They assumed my intentions were always flawed, always excessive. Illness crept in quietly, like a thief. Joint pain. Breathlessness. Fatigue that sleep didn't fix. I mentioned it once casually over breakfast. "I feel a bit weak these days," I said, stirring oatmeal for Lily. Karen glanced up briefly. "That happens with age." End of conversation. Nothing more. No questions. No concern. I stopped mentioning it. When dizziness blurred my vision, I clung to counters until it passed. When pain woke me at night, I lay still, afraid of disturbing anyone. Strength, I decided, was silence. Independence, dignity. What I didn't realize was that I was vanishing in front of people who had learned not to notice me. Explanations became apologies. Every word I spoke was filtered, every action justified. "Sorry, I didn't realize." "Sorry, I'll do it differently." "Sorry, I didn't mean to cause trouble." Even when I didn't know what the trouble was. One evening, a plate slipped from my hands. It shattered on the tile floor, a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen. "You should be more careful," Karen said without looking up from her phone. I knelt to clean it, knees aching. "I will," I murmured. No one stopped to help. No one even noticed my trembling hands. The children were scattered, David caught up in work calls, Lily upstairs doing homework. The moment passed as if nothing happened. That night, I cried silently, not for the plate, but for the realization. I had been trained to absorb the weight of life, to bend until I broke. And no one noticed. Days blurred into routines. I became an observer of my own life. My existence reduced to instructions. Grandma, watch Lily for 5 minutes. Grandma, can you move your things? Grandma, don't do it that way. Never, Grandma, how are you? My younger daughter, Emily, called sometimes. Her voice held concern, yet distance. Everything okay there? She'd ask. Yes, I lied. Don't worry. Worry, I had learned, was a burden they didn't need. I had carried enough of my own. One afternoon, I overheard Karen on the phone, unaware I could hear every word. She's becoming difficult, she said. Difficult. A small word, but sharp, cutting through me. Difficult because I walked slowly? Because I spoke gently? Because I existed? David said nothing. His silence was complicity. Neglect was no longer passive. It had texture, voice, and judgment. Neglect escalated from invisible to dangerous. One morning, while reaching for a dish in the kitchen, my legs gave way. I collapsed. The kitchen tiles were cold under my hands. Faces hovered above me, startled, concerned, but fleetingly. At the hospital, tests were run. Blood pressure, heart, lab work. Stress, they said. Fatigue, they said. Age-related changes. Everyone looked serious. But that concern lasted exactly 3 days. After that, routines resumed. The world moved on, leaving me to my silent pain. I returned to my room, my carefully measured breath, my invisible suffering. Neglect morphed into suspicion. If I looked tired, I was dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I was upset about something. If I tried to explain, I was creating tension. No version of me was acceptable. I realized that simply existing was now interpreted as a problem. I stopped trying to be understood. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. Every explanation felt like pouring water into a cup with no bottom. Family gatherings became performances. I smiled at relatives who praised my patience or strong character. You're lucky, they said. Your children take care of you. I smiled. Correcting them would require explaining, and I was tired. Even when I spoke, words were twisted. If I said something wrong, tell me, I once asked. You're too sensitive, came the reply. I swallowed my sensitivity. Folded it neatly, stored it away. Days passed unmarked. I measured time by exhaustion. By how much strength it took to endure a conversation. By how relieved I felt when night fell. I was a ghost in my own life. My presence no longer altered the world, except when something broke or went wrong. Then attention returned, sharp and accusatory. You didn't say anything. Why didn't you explain? Explain. What? That I was lonely? That my body ached? That I felt invisible in the house I helped build? I had explained my whole life. Why was it my responsibility to make my pain convenient for others? One afternoon, I quietly asked myself, what would happen if I stopped trying? The question was dangerous. Radical. Frightening. But it lingered. I realized neglect was not cruelty. It was casual. Absence of consideration. It was love without engagement. presence without empathy. Weeks later, another fainting spell brought faces rushing, phones calling, urgent voices, but only temporarily. Once stable, the household returned to its habitual rhythm. Care lasted hours, not days. Concern was fleeting, shallow. I understood then, I existed as long as it was convenient. I stopped explaining myself for small things. For minor misunderstandings. For minor accusations. I no longer defended every word or action. I let misinterpretations stand. I accepted blame quietly. Not because I agreed, but because I was done bleeding my life for others' convenience. The slow erosion of my energy had reached its limit. And in that quiet, small rebellion, I began to imagine another way to live, where I was not constantly proving my worth. Where my pain did not require translation. Where peace did not require permission. And that thought, small and tender, frightened me and comforted me in equal measure. The ultimate betrayal. Betrayal does not always arrive as a knife in the back. Sometimes, it is a room full of people choosing comfort over truth, appearances over care, convenience over empathy. After my fainting spell, I returned home from the hospital to the same house, the same routines, but the atmosphere had shifted. Concern hardened into observation. Care became calculation. Every movement I made was measured, interpreted, scrutinized. If I rested too long, I was overdoing it. If I moved slowly, I was putting on a show. If I acted normal, I was hiding something. I felt like a suspect in my own life. My body had not recovered fully. My joints ached, my hands trembled when holding a cup of coffee. Some mornings, even lifting a spoon made me gasp slightly. Yet, every symptom became evidence against me. Every sigh, every pause, every quiet movement was catalogued in the minds of my family as a potential deception. One morning, I asked David, my eldest son, if he could drive me to a routine doctor's appointment. My voice was soft, careful, trained to sound non-demanding. "I don't feel right," I said. "I feel weak and dizzy sometimes." David, weary from work and 1,000 other responsibilities, barely looked up from his phone. "We just went to the doctor last week," he said. "They said everything's normal. What more do you want?" I wanted to say, "I want someone to see me. To understand that I am still here. That my life matters." Instead, I nodded, swallowed my fear, and replied, "You're right. I'll be fine." That was the beginning of a new chapter. My silence, my pain, my very existence, began to be treated as evidence of guilt. A few days later, Karen, my daughter-in-law, approached me in the kitchen. Her voice was calm, polite, but beneath it was a sharpness that cut deeper than anger. "If you're unhappy here," she said, "you should say so." "I'm not unhappy," I replied, truthfully. "Then why are you so quiet all the time?" she asked. "Why do you look upset?" I searched for words that would not be twisted. I had spent my life carefully choosing them. "I'm just tired," I said. "Everyone is tired," she snapped. There it was, the line that erased my pain completely. I was tired, yes. But not in a way that could be measured, explained, or understood by them. My exhaustion was invisible. After that conversation, whispers replaced silence. Glances replaced words. Every expression I made was scrutinized. I could feel conclusions forming about me before I even spoke. One afternoon, I overheard a private conversation. I was in my room, pretending to read, when voices floated down the hallway. "She's trying to create sympathy," Karen said to someone I couldn't identify. "She wants attention," another voice added. She keeps acting sick, but doctors didn't find anything serious. Attention. I had spent my entire life avoiding it. My very existence was being reframed as manipulation. My honesty, as deceit. My quiet moments, as theatrical performance. I froze, my body trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of realization. This wasn't just neglect anymore. This was betrayal. That evening, David called me into the living room. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle. Faces were serious, expectant, distant. It felt less like a conversation and more like a tribunal. "We need to talk," he said. I sat slowly, legs aching, heart pounding. No one offered comfort. No one asked how I was. "You've been acting differently," he continued. "It's affecting the peace of the house." Peace. The same word they had always wielded against me. "I don't understand," I whispered. "What have I done?" Karen spoke next, her voice precise, cold. "You're always sad. Always quiet. Lily notices it. It creates negativity." Negativity. My presence had been reduced to a problem, my silence a disruption, my existence a liability. "I never meant," I began. "See," she interrupted. "You always explain. Always justify. That's exhausting for everyone." The irony was unbearable. I had spent decades explaining myself, justifying my intentions, softening my words so no one would feel accused, and now, even that effort had become evidence against me. I looked at David, my son, my child. Surely, he would stop this. Surely, he would defend me. He looked away. That was the betrayal, the knife I had not seen coming. Not the accusations. Not the words. But the refusal to protect the truth. The refusal to see me as I had been. The refusal to recognize that love does not require proof of worth. Something inside me collapsed, not dramatically, but completely. Like a dam that had been holding back years of water, finally giving in. "I don't want to cause problems," I said softly. "I'll try to be better." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. They nodded, satisfied, and the meeting ended. The house returned to its normal rhythm. But I did not. Weeks later, small sums of money went missing. Not enough to trigger a major investigation, but enough to generate tension. Drawers were searched, cabinets opened, bags checked. And me? No one asked me directly. They assumed, without evidence, without conversation. Finally, David asked in the harshest tone I had ever heard. "Did you take the money?" "No," I said immediately. "Why would I?" "We're just asking," he said quickly. "Don't take it the wrong way." How else was I supposed to take it? Their suspicion clung to me like a second skin. My room was searched while I sat there quietly, hands folded, heart racing. My belongings, letters, old photographs, medicine, were handled as if I were guilty before evidence existed. Later, the money was found, misplaced, forgotten, in plain sight. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of the injustice. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, shivering with humiliation and anger I could not voice. Trust does not break with a shout. It dissolves quietly, steadily, until nothing remains. I realized I was no longer safe, not physically, not emotionally. My intentions were no longer assumed good. My pain was no longer believed. My presence was no longer welcome. And yet, I was expected to remain grateful. Each accusation, each whisper, each judgment, was a small fracture in the foundation of my spirit. I understood then with painful clarity, love that requires you to disappear is not love. Belonging that depends on silence is not safety. One afternoon, Emily, my younger daughter, visited. She noticed my weight loss, my hollowed face, my quiet demeanor. She asked softly, "Grandma, what's happening?" For the first time, I considered speaking the truth. "Just a little. They think I pretend," I said. "They think I cause problems." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to fight my battles," I replied. That night, Emily raised her voice in conversation with David, tension filling the house. The next morning, David came to my room, sighing. "You should have told us you were unhappy," he said. "Instead of involving others." Involving others. My pain, reframed as gossip. My life, reduced to drama. I understood then, it would always be wrong here. If I stayed silent, I was manipulative. If I spoke, I was disruptive. If I endured, I was dramatic. If I asked for help, I was needy. No version of me was acceptable. And so, something inside me gave up, not in despair, but in self-preservation. I stopped defending myself. When accusations came, I listened without reacting. When misunderstandings arose, I let them stand. When blamed, I accepted it quietly. Not because I agreed, but because I was done. They mistook my calm for guilt, my silence for surrender. What they did not see was the slow, deliberate closing of a door inside me. I began imagining a life where I was not constantly proving my worth. Where my pain did not require translation. Where peace did not need permission. And for the first time, I chose myself. Even if only in my mind. Once that choice was made, nothing could return to the way it was. The day I stopped explaining myself. There was no dramatic announcement. No shouting. No packed bags. No confrontation. No sudden grand gesture that would make anyone pause and notice. The day I stopped explaining myself looked almost like any other day. I woke before sunrise, as I had done for decades, but this morning felt different. My body ached in familiar ways, the stiffness in my knees, the dull ache in my shoulders, but the pain felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. Someone I had long tolerated, but no longer needed to define me. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the house breathe. The ceiling fan whirred above me, a soft drone that had always been background noise. I heard pipes creaking, the muffled sound of a car starting outside, and someone shifting in the other bedroom. And for the first time in years, I did not plan my day around anyone else's comfort. That was the beginning. In the kitchen, I made my morning tea slowly, deliberately. Steam rose in gentle curls, warming my face. When the cup slipped slightly in my weak hand, I steadied it without panic. If it broke, it broke. I was tired of holding the world together with fear. I did not announce myself, did not ask permission, did not soften my movements to avoid attention. Karen, my daughter-in-law, entered and glanced at me. She said nothing. That silence no longer demanded filling. I sipped my tea slowly, savoring the warmth, savoring the quiet, savoring the absence of expectation. When David asked later, "Why didn't you clean up the living room?" I looked up calmly. "I didn't feel well," I said. No apology followed. No explanation. Just a simple statement. And I meant it. David blinked, surprised. "You could have said something," he murmured. "I did," I replied. And I meant it. That small exchange marked a seismic shift inside me. For decades, I had believed that clarity required justification. That truth needed cushioning. That my feelings were only valid if they were palatable to others. That morning, I realized something terrifying in its simplicity. I did not owe anyone a performance of my life. I did not owe explanations for my body, my feelings, my choices. I did not owe the world my constant justification. The house reacted subtly at first. Confusion replaced irritation. My silence was firm rather than anxious. When comments came, I answered briefly. When questions carried accusation, I responded only to what was asked. Are you upset? No. Why are you so quiet? This is how I am today. I did not elaborate. I did not soften. I did not chase understanding. And strangely, the world did not end. Each unspoken explanation felt like setting down a heavy bag I had carried for decades. I stopped anticipating misunderstandings, stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. If they misunderstood me, it belonged to them. If they judged me, that too belonged to them. My energy was no longer currency to buy their approval. I began spending more time in my room, not hiding, but choosing solitude. I read books slowly, savoring sentences, absorbing ideas without feeling guilty that I was taking time for myself. I wrote in a small notebook, not explanations, not complaints, just observations. Words flowed differently now, freely, without needing to please or soften. Each morning, I set small boundaries. I did not rush to serve meals. I did not immediately respond to questions. I did not smooth over tension or excuse anyone's impatience. I observed. I waited. I existed on my own terms. At first, my calm and assertiveness unsettled the household. Without my constant explanations, there was a gap. They had grown used to my labor, emotional, physical, intellectual, as automatic. Now, with the absence of constant appeasement, small cracks appeared. David hesitated before making decisions he had once assumed I would guide with my quiet counsel. Karen paused, expecting me to intervene when a child refused dinner or homework remained incomplete. The absence of my explanations forced them to take responsibility for their own chaos. It was both satisfying and uncomfortable to watch. I did not interfere. I merely observed, noting the ways the household relied on me as invisible scaffolding. My granddaughter, Lily, began noticing the changes. You don't talk as much, she said one afternoon while sitting beside me on the porch swing. I talk enough, I replied gently. She studied me, curious. Children are instinctively perceptive. They see things adults have learned to ignore. Why? She asked. Because I don't need to explain everything to everyone, I said, smiling slightly. Sometimes, it's enough just to be. Her small face lit up with understanding. She did not challenge me. She did not seek correction. She simply accepted the quiet authority of my presence. I realized that for the first time in decades, I was teaching someone the lesson I had just learned myself, that peace is more important than validation. My younger daughter, Sarah, visited that week. She had always been gentle, always perceptive, but she had a lifetime of caution around conflict. She came expecting to rescue me, to intervene, to correct the injustices she assumed were ongoing. Instead, I offered her a calm presence. I did not unload my grievances. I did not plead for sympathy. I simply existed. You seem different, she said softly. I am, I replied. And that's not something I need to explain. She smiled, nodded slowly, and for the first time, I felt understood without words. Validation, I realized, does not require justification. Each day, I became more comfortable with my decision. Silence became a boundary. Calm became defiance. Walking away, whether physically, emotionally, or psychologically, became self-respect. Old habits whispered, maybe you should explain. Maybe you're being unfair. I listened, then let them pass. I had explained enough for one lifetime. The woman I was becoming did not need to be understood by everyone. She needed only to be at peace with herself. I began to notice the subtle ways the household responded. Karen and David tried to provoke responses. Little comments aimed at irritation. Questions designed to elicit guilt. I simply answered, if necessary, and then let the conversation go. I no longer offered clarifications, no longer smoothed tensions. The absence of my emotional labor unsettled them, but they adapted, or floundered. I started caring for myself differently. Meals were prepared when I wanted, not when it was convenient for others. I exercised gently, walked in the neighborhood at sunset, read in the living room instead of waiting for someone to ask. I spent more time with neighbors and friends, people who valued me without demanding explanation. Pain still existed, chronic, nagging, physical reminders of age, but it was no longer compounded by emotional exhaustion. I no longer carried the invisible burden of justifying every breath I took. At first, the family did not understand. Comments were cautious. Conversations became measured. My presence no longer triggered assumptions. Without my explanations, the household had to confront itself. Tensions that I once absorbed now remained, unresolved, exposing the fragile dynamics beneath. Karen stopped trying to correct me. David stopped interpreting every pause or sigh. The house, for the first time in years, adjusted to the absence of my constant acquiescence. And I flourished. Days passed in a rhythm that belonged to me. Morning tea on the porch. Books on the sofa. Quiet walks in the park. Visits from Lily and Sarah became moments of genuine connection rather than rescue missions. I began keeping a small journal, thoughts, observations, gratitude. Not explanations. Not apologies. Even the mundane became rich, the smell of coffee brewing, the warmth of sunlight through the blinds, the laughter of children in the neighborhood. I had finally learned to observe without filtering myself. To participate without sacrificing myself. Doubt crept in occasionally. Old habits whispered, maybe you should explain. Maybe you're being unfair. Maybe you're letting them think you're cold. I heard the familiar voice of self-erasure. But each time, I paused, breathed, and let it pass. I had stopped carrying the emotional weight of the house. I had stopped translating my pain into something digestible for others. I had stopped performing my life for approval. And in that refusal, I found freedom. Lily, now old enough to understand, approached me one evening. "Grandma," she said, "I think I understand why you don't explain yourself as much anymore." "You do?" I asked, surprised. "Yes," she said. "You're showing me it's okay to just be. That not everything has to be fixed or justified." Her words filled me with quiet pride. Perhaps this, too, was my inheritance, the knowledge that one could exist fully, authentically, without constant apology. The day I stopped explaining myself was not a single, dramatic event. It was a series of small decisions, tiny rebellions, moments of quiet defiance that accumulated into something unshakable. I did not announce it. I did not seek approval. I did not demand acknowledgement. I simply stopped. And in that stopping, I began to live. For the first time in decades, I belonged fully to myself. I did not stop loving my family, I stopped disappearing for them. I did not abandon them. I abandoned the expectation that my existence required justification. And in that stillness, that absence of explanation, I found peace. The new life. Peace did not arrive all at once. It did not burst into my life with fanfare, nor did it require recognition from anyone else. It arrived slowly, quietly, like sunlight spilling through blinds in a bedroom long untouched. It moved deliberately, touching corners I had forgotten, filling spaces that had once been dominated by expectation and obligation. The first thing that changed was my relationship with time. For most of my life, time belonged to others. I woke when needed, waited when expected, moved according to schedules not my own. Every sunrise was dictated by alarms, school runs, work schedules, or family routines. Now, days unfolded differently. I woke when my body was ready. I rested when I felt tired. I ate when I was hungry. I spoke when I had something to say, and stayed silent when I did not. There was no need for explanation. No justification. No preemptive smoothing over. And, remarkably, no one demanded it. Mornings became my sacred space. I lingered over my coffee, sipping it slowly on the back porch, feeling the cold metal of the mug warm my palms. I watched the neighborhood wake up, the joggers, the dog walkers, the early risers heading to work. I observed without judgment, without involvement. I no longer had to insert myself into someone else's narrative. I began walking every morning. Just 15 or 20 minutes at first, around the quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood. I noticed the way the sun hit the tops of maple trees, how leaves drifted lazily in the breeze, and how my own breathing could slow, steady, and expand. It felt revolutionary to move solely for myself, with no obligation to justify my steps, my pace, my choices. At first, guilt accompanied this freedom. Guilt, after a lifetime of self-erasure, has a long memory. It whispered, "You're selfish. You should be doing more. You're abandoning them." I acknowledged it, but I no longer obeyed. Self-respect, I realized, often feels like wrongdoing to those accustomed to exploiting your endurance. The absence of my explanations began to reshape the household, subtly but powerfully. David and Karen, my son and daughter-in-law, were initially disoriented. They had grown accustomed to my constant presence, my mediation of tension, my smoothing over of conflict. Now, with my emotional labor absent, the air in the house changed. Laughter returned in small doses, not because I enabled it, but because they were learning to navigate their own dynamics without my intervention. Disagreements lingered longer, but that was no longer my responsibility. I watched quietly from the kitchen doorway, observing without interference. Decisions were made differently now, more slowly, more thoughtfully. And I let them take ownership. For the first time, I understood that my constant involvement had masked their weaknesses, my presence had softened their conflicts, my explanations had made their lives easier. Without me, they would grow, or flounder, or learn lessons they had long avoided. And it was not my duty to ensure their comfort anymore. Lily, my granddaughter, began noticing the change in me. She approached me one evening after dinner. "Grandma," she said, "you seem lighter." I smiled, brushing a strand of gray hair from my face. "I am," I said. "Because I'm not carrying what isn't mine anymore." Her eyes widened. Children have a rare clarity. They sense the invisible burdens of adults without needing explanation. "So, it's okay to just be?" she asked. "Yes," I replied gently. "It's okay to be without explaining, without justifying, without performing. You don't owe anyone your peace." She thought about it for a moment, then nodded slowly, storing that lesson somewhere deep inside her. It was perhaps the most meaningful inheritance I could give, not money, not advice, not approval, but the quiet knowledge that self-respect matters more than appeasement. Daily life became a series of small liberations. I cooked only when I wanted, not when asked. I read books in the living room without worrying if I was being seen as lazy. I watched old movies on the couch with the blanket I had brought from my room. I listened to music in the mornings, letting it fill my apartment without feeling guilty that someone might find it annoying. Even chores became voluntary, done for the pleasure of moving, for the satisfaction of completion, not out of duty or expectation. Laundry folded, dishes washed, garden tended, all became acts of self-care rather than obligation. The family had to adjust. Karen would pause mid-conversation, expecting me to smooth over tension. David would hesitate before making a decision that once automatically assumed my approval. Their subtle dependence on me was replaced by subtle confusion. They tried, occasionally, to provoke reactions or guilt. I did not respond beyond necessity. They were learning, slowly, that my presence was no longer unconditional. That my love was still there, but my labor, my emotional work, my explanations, those were no longer on demand. Without these invisible services, the family dynamics shifted. It was unsettling for them. It was liberating for me. I reconnected with friends I had long neglected. Jane, my college friend, invited me for morning coffee. We laughed over old memories, shared stories of loss and triumph, and simply existed in each other's presence without expectation. I attended a weekly book club at the local library. I met women who had lived lives similar to mine, caretakers, givers, the overlooked. We shared struggles, offered advice, and sometimes just listened. Being among people who understood, who did not require me to explain or justify my existence, was intoxicating. Even volunteering became selective. I helped when I wanted to, not because it was expected. The world could exist without my labor, and so could I. I began reflecting on decades of self-erasure. The woman I had been, always accommodating, always explaining, always mediating, had survived, yes, but at a cost. My body carried scars of fatigue, my mind carried patterns of caution, my heart carried years of silent compromises. But that woman had been necessary. She had ensured family stability, nurtured children, softened conflicts. She had survived. And now, the woman I was becoming could finally live. Living, I realized, does not require sacrifice. Living does not require constant approval. Living does not require explaining every thought, every feeling, every move. I discovered joy in ordinary things. The smell of fresh-baked bread. The sound of wind in the trees. A quiet walk to the neighborhood park, greeting strangers without worrying what they thought. Reading poetry aloud in the morning sun. Taking afternoon naps that were purely restorative. I even began keeping a small journal, recording moments of gratitude, observations of life, thoughts about family, not criticisms, not complaints, not explanations, just reflections. Words became a mirror for myself, not a translation for others. David approached me one evening. "Mom, I notice you don't explain yourself as much," he said. "Did we hurt you?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "But I'm not angry. I just needed peace." He looked confused, relieved, and for the first time, he seemed to see me not as the constant caretaker, but as a person with limits, a person deserving respect, a person whose presence required no justification. Lily began seeking me out, not for supervision or intervention, but for conversation, for shared moments, for guidance that was generous rather than obligatory. She asked questions about life, choices, and boundaries. And I answered, freely, without fear of judgment. Some relatives commented on my change. "She's distant now," one said. She doesn't explain herself anymore, said another. She's very quiet. I accepted it. Distance is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the boundary that keeps you whole. I did not cut anyone off. I did not create scenes. I simply stopped bridging emotional gaps alone. Relationships that required constant effort faded. Relationships that remained grew steadier, calmer, and more honest. I began doing things simply because I enjoyed them. Cooking became a meditation. Reading became an adventure. Walking became a communion with the world outside. Silence became a companion, not a punishment. I no longer needed to fill gaps for the sake of others' comfort. I discovered that happiness is not a grand event. It is a quiet accumulation of moments where you are fully present for yourself. It is listening to the world without the obligation to translate it into someone else's terms. In the evenings, I sat by the window, watching the sky change colors. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who bent, explained, sacrificed, and disappeared. I did not judge her. She had done what she had to do to survive. But survival is not living. Living came later. Quietly. Deliberately. Free of explanations, guilt, or obligation. I did not need validation. I did not need applause. I did not need to be understood by everyone. I understood myself. And that was enough. If someone asked me what happiness looked like now, I would say, it is silence that does not ache. It is boundaries that do not require defense. It is love that does not cost your dignity. I had not stopped loving my family. I had stopped disappearing for them. And in that stillness, free of explanation, I had finally come home to myself. Thank you for spending your time with Brinicle Reads. If this story touched you, stirred something inside, or reminded you of your own journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who might need it. And subscribe to Brinicle Reads. Until next time, keep going.